Hi, I'm Trish from TrishNewbery.com and welcome to the sew along for the Dani Dolman. So this dress is for woven fabrics. I'm using a plain sewing machine and I'll use a 3-thread overlock on the raw edge to tidy my edges up. The other thing with this pattern is you'll need some bias binding tape, and the amount of that is on the information sheet. And you'll also need a small amount of elastic. I have put suggested cut amounts. You can measure yourself at the correct place to change that if you want. So I'm using self-bias binding. So I've just cut some from leftover fabric when I was cutting this sample out, and I'll show you how I'm going to attach that with my binding foot. But when it comes to binding, you can just use purchased pre-folded binding. So let's just jump straight into it and get started. We're going to start by sewing the bodice. So place your back and your front right sides together. So what this means is take your back bodice piece and place it right side up, and then take your front bodice pieces and place them right side down. Just better make sure I've got the right side. There we go. And what we're going to do is we're going to match the shoulder seams. So the shoulder seams you should be able to find, because they're these long curved ones right by the neckline. So there is a notch to match as you go down that seam. So what we're going to do is sew from the neck to the hem here. Now this finishes just above the elbow. So we're going to sew this in a 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Remember to back tack at the beginning and end. Okay, so we've sewn one shoulder, we'll just go straight across and sew the other shoulder. Right, so now let's go to our overlocker and just tidy up that raw edge. Now you only need 3 threads in your overlocker. I personally like to use a wide 3 threads, so I'll use my left needle and then my lower loopers and remove this. But just for this garment, I'm going to leave it as 4 threads. It really doesn't make a difference. So what we need to do now is go to our iron and press those seams so they face towards the back. So we're going to open this up and press them that way. I'm using a binder foot to attach the binding to my neckline. You can buy these from Chinese websites for domestic sewing machines. You can also buy them clearly for commercial sewing machines. There has been a big advertising blitz at the moment, and I know that because they borrowed my YouTube footage without my permission to promote their sales. So anyway, you can buy them, they're really handy. It is a fast way of attaching binding. You just have to get used to cutting the binding yourself or buying pre-purchased. So what you do is just attach the binding in any way you prefer. I'm going to start from the centre front and go through to the centre front, and I'm going to sew it on with the right side up. So when you feed this tape through, it is wrong side facing you, and we're just going to sew it onto the neckline like this. I'll just trim this back, my serger thread, my overlocker thread, just to catch it within the stitching of the binding. So the main thing to think of is just don't stretch, don't allow that angle at the front V-neck to stretch out too much as you sew. We don't want to end up with any waviness or puckering. If you like the look of the binding on the edge, you can leave it at that stage, but I'm going to do a faux internal bind. So what that means is I'm literally going to turn the binding to the inside and stitch it down so that on the outside of my fabric all I see is a stitch line instead of the binding. So as I said, if you like the look of the binding, leave it. If you don't, stitch it down. So I've suggested 6mm 1/4 inch finish binding. So I'm going to stitch just short of that to make sure I catch it. So it's very easy to pucker this as you stitch, so just be very careful. You might prefer to iron this first. I always prefer to iron it afterwards. What we're looking for is stitching with that binding pushed right out to the edge. Okay, so when you've done that, go to your iron, give it a press, and we can move on. Now we're going to edge tidy the entire front, but not the V-neck. So we're going to start at the centre front, go all the way back to the centre front on the other side. Now you can cut this extra binding piece off with your cutter here on with your blade on your serger if you like, or you could just snip it off in a straight line. On your sleeve edge you'll be able to see a notch through your overlocking line. Go and press that sleeve hem into place from one side to the other. Make sure you do it both sides. I believe it is 1.596 of an inch. It might be closer to 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch. Can't remember. Anyway, just make sure you give it a press at that turn mark, and we can then start to sew the side seams. So what we're going to do is fold our bodice so that right sides are together and our side seams match like this. We're going to sew from the waist through to that sleeve seam that we have just pressed into place. We're going to sew this at 1 centimetre. Make sure you back tack. Now as we approach this hem here for our arm to go through, this is the area we want to leave a gap for our elastic. Some people like to sew the whole seam and unpick a small amount of the seam to thread the elastic through afterwards. Okay, so we want to leave a gap for turning, and we need to leave the gap for turning close to the well, we need to make sure it's on the inside. So what I'm going to do is stitch through to just after our fold turn position and stop and back tack. So here's my fold, gone past it, and I'm back tacking it off. And then I'm going to leave a small gap of about maybe 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to start stitching again, remembering to back tack. So what this has done, I'll just pull that thread through. So what this has done has left a small area for turning. If you can see here, this is an area that I can feed my elastic through, and I won't have to worry about finishing it off and closing the seam if I want to. So it's just there. Ideally I should have left it about there, so in a perfect world it would be around about there. So what you can do now is, once you've done both sides, you can go ahead and stitch the hem of that sleeve into place through the overlocking line to create an area for our elastic to be thread through. And I'm going to start and finish from the underarm point. Now we're going to work on our elastic. So I've put suggested cut lengths on the chart on the construction sequence page. So if you want to just measure this, and it's going to depend a little bit on the firmness of your elastic as well, is measure your arm just above the elbow and measure it there, and then add a small amount for sewing this together. So maybe 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch on. Just make sure your elastic's not too tight. This does need to sit comfortably, but of course the tighter it is, the more of that ladylike puff you'll get in the sleeve, because the elastic will help create the puff. Okay, so once you have the elastic sorted out, we're going to thread it through that seam, and I'm just going to take a safety pin. You can use a hair clip if you prefer, a hair slide. The underarm seam should be sewn open like so. We're going to find that gap we left to feed our elastic through, and just feed that through the sleeve opening. Okay, so come out the same hole you went in at. And now what we want to do is sew these two together. So just overlap them by the seam allowance, which I allowed 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, or whatever your personal preference is. And just making sure they're flat and not twisted, stitch those two together with some, either a zigzag stitch if you prefer, or some straight stitches forwards and back, whichever way you prefer to have your elastic sewn together with. And then just pull that back into the hem so the join disappears. Okay. So there we have it. My elastic is pulled back. Now from the right side you can't tell there was an opening, and there's the opening on the back side. If you want to, you can go ahead and stitch that closed with a hand stitch, but it's entirely up to you. So just remember to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. To sew the centre front seam, place your fronts right side together and match the centre fronts, and we want to match the binding as well. So what we're going to do is sew the seam at 1 centimetre. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, if you go to your iron and press that seam open, and I'm going to just trim these overlocking threads back to around about 1 inch, a couple of centimetres. And when I sew, I'm going to make sure that all that overlocking seam is caught down. So what we're going to do is if you press that open and then come to the right side of your garment, we are now going to hold that seam open by just doing a very small stitch on the existing sew line. So it's just forward a couple and back a couple, and because I'm here I may as well just turn it around like this and do the same thing on the other side. We're just going to hold that in place just to make sure that seam will sit open and make sure all the mess is hidden underneath. So that's what we're left with. Yes, I could have matched my patterns slightly better, but it's a bit stressful when you're in front of a camera trying to do this all at the same time. Alright, so now let's work on the skirt layers. With the skirt layers, we have pieces cut on the fold. We've got 2 layers, so an upper layer and a lower layer. So the lower layer we've cut 2 exactly the same. One's for the front, one's for the back. And on the upper layer we have a back piece which is essentially a rectangle, and then the front which has a curve to it. To save time, and everyone likes to do gathering a little bit differently, what I'm going to do is edge finish all of my 4 pieces at the side seams now, so I don't have to do it later. And it's also quite handy to do before you start to get involved in sewing the seams. The other thing is I like my gathering layers for the side seams to be pressed open, not closed. So you can do it your way, you can do it my way, but what I'm going to do is essentially do all 4 pieces side seam finishing now before I go any further. I'm now going to work on layer 2. So this is the very bottom layer. The 2 rectangles have been cut exactly the same size. So the first thing you need to do is find the edge that has the notches in it and mark them somehow, because that edge with the notches in it are our quarter marks for our gathering, and they're the upper edge, whereas the edge without any marks is our hem. So when you know you have the upper edge, place these pieces right sides together and simply sew the side seams in a 1 centimetre seam allowance and then press them open. Now if you want to do regular gathering, just go ahead and do it. What I thought I'd do with this sample, because I've made so many of these now, these dresses, I just thought I'd change the sample up a teeny bit. There's quite a cool trend with this gathered look to have all the gathering stitched on the outside of the garment. There is a name for it, I just can't quite remember it at the moment, it'll come back to me. But what we're doing is, instead of sewing right sides together, we're going to sew right side to wrong side. And it just looks quite effective with the bottom tier, so I thought I'd do this with the bottom tier. So long story short, if you want to do this with the stitching on top, follow me. If not, I will explain how to do the gathering as we go. Now, if I was doing this in commercial construction as a pattern, we wouldn't actually have these notches here before we begin. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish the seam off before we start, and I've changed this to a 3-thread overlock, so 3 thread serge, my right needle and my 2 lower loopers, and I have done some adjustments just to make sure that this is going to look nice. So my serged edge is going to be exposed stitching. So I'm going to start at one of the side seams, and I'm starting on the side that has the notches in it, so the top edge. And all I'm going to do is just serge finish that top edge right around the top. Now we're going to jump ahead and complete the hem. Now we're going to jump ahead and complete the hem on tier 2, the bottom of the skirt. There's 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch allowed for. You can complete this hem any way you like. You could make it deeper, it wouldn't really make a difference. I'm going to overlock serge finish the edge and press up by 1 centimetre, but you certainly could do a double fold if you wanted. So I've changed my serger back to, I've done it a 3-thread as well, but I'm using my left needle and my 2 lower loopers now. So I'm just doing a wide overlock finish to that hem edge. Now I'm going to go to my iron and press that up 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. Now I've pressed that hem into place, I'm going to stitch it down through the overlocking line. And I'm just going to start this from a side seam. Okay, so it's a good idea to press this before you go any further, and then we're going to put this aside and start working on tier 1, the upper skirt layer. Now we're working on skirt layer 1, the upper level, so place your front and back right sides together. Now the back doesn't matter which is the top, it's the same both sides, so there's a notch in the centre. The top of the front is the higher curve. So just place those side seams right sides together, so a 1 centimetre seam, and then press them open. Once you have those side seams pressed open, if you're doing the exposed gathering technique, what we're going to do is just edge stitch finish the straight edge, the bottom. If you just want to do a normal gather, skip this step. So all I'm going to do is just tidy up the long straight bottom edge. So now let's run a gathering thread at the top of layer 2. Now you'll be doing this regardless of whether you're going to do the exposed gathers or normal gathers. All I'm going to do is extend my stitch length and run my gathering thread. I'm running one across the front and another across the back at 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. The next thing that's really handy to do is just to find those notches through the overlocking thread and mark them with a pin. So now at this point, make sure you know which side is the right side, because you're going to find it so much easier gathering from the right side. So pick a side, call it the front. Front and back are the same, makes no difference. And take one of the gather threads and just roughly draw that up. Just to make this fabric easier to work with. And do the same on the other side, and make sure you're only ever pulling the thread from one side. If you pull a gather thread from one side and then the other side, so the top of the fabric and the underside of the fabric, the stitches will lock and you have to start again from the beginning. Okay, and I'll just do that on the back as well. So if you're doing the exposed gathering, this is exactly the same as if you are doing just a regular gather. So take the tier 1 and find the center point notches on the straight edge, which is the bottom edge. You should be able to see them through your overlocking, or just fold it in half and you'll find them, the halfway point. Okay. And we want to make sure the straight edge is the edge we're going to sew to. So we're sewing the bottom gathers to, so tier 2 gathers to tier 1. Right, so if you're doing just a regular gather, now what you will do is put right sides together, match the side seams, match the notches, and stitch through the overlocking line. That's just your regular gather, and we'll do that for tier 1. If you want to do the exposed gathers, this is what we're going to do. So as I said, it makes no difference whether you are, it makes no difference the front to the back. So what we're going to do is take this gather piece and start matching the seams, but instead of matching them on the right sides together, we're matching them right side to wrong side. So we want both of the fronts facing in the same direction. So what I'm doing is just roughly now I'm going to match my center point notches and my side seams. And this does feel really awkward. What you can do, once you have the first one matched, is tip it to the center, and it might find it easy. So we just have to work our way through this, match those positions. Now what I'm going to do to make it easier to see, I'm going to turn my stitch length back to normal, and I'm going to put the tier 1 layer through to the right and the tier 2 layer with the gathers to the left, and I have to be very careful that I'm not going to catch the wrong part of the fabric. So what I've done is I've sort of shimmied this inside out. It's really awkward when you start this, but once you start it, start sewing it, it all comes together really easily. Alright, so here is a side seam. Once you've organised it all so it'll be easier for you to sew, we've got one layer here and one layer there. We want this all out of the way. Match a side seam. Once we have the side seam matched, we want to overlap this by 2 centimetres, which is 3/4 of an inch, because we have a 1 centimetre seam allowance on this side, so it's about there, 3/8 of an inch, and we need that line there to sit exactly where our stitch line is for our gathers. And I'm really lucky that this is a check because I'll be able to follow the line. So what I'm going to do now is just a really quick back tack, and I'm going to make sure I don't get my gathering thread caught in it. Just a couple of stitches to hold this. Right. Now I need to distribute the gathers between that point and the centre point, which is the notch I pinned down. Now we roughly gathered them. Now's your chance to just by eye distribute them nice and evenly. Okay, so when you have the gathers distributed the way you want, we're going to sew this down, and we're going to sew it directly through the gathering line. If you don't have a line to follow like me, you could always draw a chalk line on your fabric at that 2 centimetre 3/4 inch line, just to make sure that everything's going in the correct position. Alright, so I'm approaching my midway notch, so I'm going to remove that pin. And come across to the side seam. Right, so we'll just continue through doing the same thing through to the other side. Now we've reached our start point, what we have to do is generally try and remove all of that gathering thread. Now we're sewing the skirt to the bodice. So earlier in the video I had already overlocked, tidied, serged the bottom edge of the bodice in anticipation of doing an exposed finish. So I'm going to run an exposed gather from the skirt to the bodice as well. Now if you're not, it's probably a good idea to tidy this edge now anyway, or you can tidy it after you've done the gathering, whatever you want to do. So I'm still going to do a narrow 3 thread, tiny bit more difficult because we have a curve at the centre front. Now just because it is an exposed finish, you just want to make sure that your balance on your serger is really good and that you've checked it out on spare fabric before you begin. And just as we did for the previous gathering, we're going to run a line of gathers at the front between the side seams and at the back between the side seams. So extend your stitch length and stitch that at 1 centimetre. Right, so when you're finished, we're just going to draw these threads up. Make sure you only draw them from one side, just like we did earlier. If you're doing the exposed gathers, place the bodice right side up. Now the centre front is this seam we've created here, and on the centre back there will be a notch. Take the skirt and place it right side up again on top. Now the very centre of the curve at the top is your centre front. There will be a mark there. There we go, you should be able to see it through your overlocking tidying, and that heightened the height of that notch there goes to the centre front. And we're going to match the side seams and the centre back as well. And then we're going to proceed exactly as we did before. When you're ready, place your garment under your presser foot, making sure you've only got the layers that you're going to sew. So the skirt's on this side, the bodice is on this side, and I'm going to start sewing the side seam in a tack stitch, just a back tack, 3 forward and 3 back. Now I'm going to distribute my gathers evenly and start stitching. Now I had a little bit of a problem in that my gathering thread locked and I had to run a second line of gathers, so I'm just going to try and make everything work. So that's the reason for my extra pin up here. So when you're comfortable that everything is sitting 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch from the edge, so by that I mean if you chalked a line from here up 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimetres, we want this raw edge to sit against it. And when you're ready, stitch it down. So just make sure you've got the one layer here and the one layer here. Okay, so I've reached the centre front seam here. Make sure when you stitch it, you have stitched the seam open. And I'll take that pin out and just continue around the rest of the garment, matching the side seam and the remaining notches as I go. What we need to do now is remove that gathering thread, and we're all finished. And if you're sewing regular gathers, all you will do with this is sew these right sides together at 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and then serge overlock finish the raw edge. So thanks so much for joining me, and thanks for buying my patterns. If you like what you see, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I hope to see you again soon.